Dear students, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we will discuss the decision-making process and foreign policy, which is the chapter 3 of the book Foreign Policy Analysis. Now, in discussing the decision-making process and foreign policy, we have some objectives in our mind. And the objectives are first, to grasp the meaning of foreign policy decision making. And second, identifying and assessing the process involved in foreign policy decision making. This means we will try to identify how decisions are made within a state structure. Okay? And another thing is to discuss the context, pressures, and constraints with which foreign policy makers have to deal. Now, let's begin first by discussing how to conceptualize foreign policy decision making. Now, first, we can say that foreign policy process is a process of decision making. From top to down, the whole process is about making decisions. The decision-making process refers to the choices of individuals, groups, and coalitions that affect a nation's actions on the international stage. Now, there is a difference between the decision-making approach and other foreign policy analysis, because the decision-making approach specifically focuses on the process instead of the outcome. This means that while the other types of analysis of foreign policy focus on the decision made or the foreign policy behavior of a state, decision-making process focuses on the process. This means how this decision was made. Now, there are certain steps in making a decision, and this is valid in the foreign policy decision-making process as well. These are: first, you should identify that there is a problem. You should perceive that there is a problem coming. You should perceive that there is a case, an issue, a problem. You have to make a decision on it. And after identifying the problem, you have to find alternatives. Which way to follow? What ways I have? Searching for alternatives is a very important phase of the decision-making process. But after determining your alternatives, you have to choose among them. And you have to choose, if you are a decision maker, the best choice. Okay. After determining your alternative, or after choosing the alternative, you have to execute the alternative. This means implement the policy. Now, there are different types of decisions depending upon the situations. Alex Mintz identified, for example, 5 types of decisions. There are other categorizations as well, which we will discuss after this categorization of Mintz. Now, there are one-shot, single decisions. Single one-shot decisions are rare in foreign policy decision-making because decisions related to foreign policy are interrelated with other decisions. They are sequential in general. But if you want to give an example, you may mention a decision of a state on joining an international treaty. This can be accepted as a single one-shot decision. Now, foreign policy decisions are mostly interactive decisions. Interaction decision means that the decision involves at least two players who make decisions that affect each other. If you make a decision, the other player, the other one will be affected, and vice versa. Sequential decisions involve a series of interrelated decisions. If you have to decide on intervening in a country, this is an interrelated situation. You have to make a number of decisions which are interrelated, and generally foreign policy decisions are mostly interrelated and interactive decisions. This means there are at least two players and a series of decisions. Now, group decisions are also very important in terms of foreign policy, and it can be said that most of foreign policy decisions are group decisions, because even the most totalitarian country's leader has to or need some people, a group of people who will assist him or her in its process of making decisions. And this means each foreign policy decision is a group decision. May the group a very small one closed around the leader, or a very broad bureaucratic mechanism which we can observe in most democratic countries, but it is a group action. Okay. Now, the other classification of the types of decisions suggests that there are three types of decisions: the macro decisions, micro decisions, and crisis decisions. Now, macro decisions occur in a broader, larger manner. This means that there are not responses or reactions to sudden, unexpected situations, and they are, on the other hand, made in a relatively large time scale, and mainly they are made within large or broad groups of decision makers. Micro decisions, on the other hand, are decisions which mainly or mostly depend on macro decisions, and therefore they are called as administrative decisions. This means they are mostly decisions made on everyday basis and are related to the implementation of a broader foreign policy. Okay, crisis decisions, on the other hand, are in a very different manner because they include high stress, tension, and they have a very short time, and of course they include surprise, threat, and danger. And the most studied decisions within the foreign policy analysis area can be said are crisis decisions, like the one we can see in the photo of the slide. It is the decision making process during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Kennedy was in a very stressful situation and had to make a crisis decision. Now, there are different approaches to the study of foreign policy decision making, the rational and cognitive approaches. Now, traditional understandings of foreign policy analysis proceed from the rational actor assumption. This means that they assume that decision makers are rational actors and make the best choice among its alternatives. The cognitive, on the other hand, the cognitive revolution in psychology showed the limits of the rationality assumption, and therefore the newer approaches turn to be more cognitive approaches. Now, what is the problem with the rational actor assumption is that human beings cannot be purely rational. This does not mean that decision makers are irrational, but we cannot accept them as purely rational. Okay? And this was showed by cognitive psychology. They revealed that decision makers make their decisions based on their perceptions, which are influenced by the information they acquire, their existing beliefs, targets, and the bureaucratic roles they undertook. Now, there are three main models of decision making, which was identified first by Graham Allison. And according to Allison, there are three different decision making models based on the structure and function of the decision making unit. The decision making unit is the point where the decision is made. Okay. The first is the rational actor model, the second the organizational process model, and the third the bureaucratic politics model. All three models have their own research agenda and they focus on different points or stages of the decision-making process. The rational actor model is the one which assumes the decision maker as rational. But the organizational process model, on the other hand, focuses on the operational procedures within the organizational process of the government mechanism, and the bureaucratic politics model focuses primarily on the political process on each state, because the bureaucratic mechanism means the internal political process of a state. Okay, now whether there are different approaches to the making of foreign policy decisions, there is one process of decision making for all situations. You have first identified the problem, and then after identifying there is a problem to decide on, you have to interpret the problem, the situation, and then determine the alternatives. After determining the alternative, you have to assess, evaluate them. The most important phase of this process is, of course, the selection of the option, but of the best option. And after this phase, implementation of the decision comes. Now, factors influencing the process of decision making can be divided into two categories: the external environment and the internal environment. Now, we have discussed the external internal relationship in foreign policy in chapter 1, and we have suggested that although foreign policy is about the external world, the internal environment of a state is a main factor influencing the making of foreign policy. Now, the external environment is clearly consisting of other states, all types of other international institutions, may they be governmental or non-governmental institutions, and of course their relations are also a factor within the external environment. The internal environment consists of the structure of the government, the bureaucracy, public opinion, interest groups, and the leader as last. The internal environment will be discussed in detail in chapter 5. Then, for now, thank you for listening and watching this lesson.